In episode 6, when Mark snaps out of it, he is visibly distraught. He's asking Saul a bunch of questions, trying to make sense of what he just saw. In order to kind of comfort him, Saul says, the Gemma that you know is in there. You just got to get her out. Once Mark is feeling a little bit better, Saul continues to do the integration process. And once she hooks Mark up, he does start connecting with his innie. It gets to the point where Saul asks him, are you at Lumen or are you with me? Mark tells her, I don't know. And she asks him, do you remember a hallway, a black hallway? Well, Mark tries to remember exactly what he did remember. The only thing he can remember, though, is a desk, and Saul thinks this is a good thing. It's a more recent crossover memory. Mark, though, is getting visibly frustrated. He wants to know when it'll all come together. Saul tells him that they need to speed up this process, which is going to involve a medical procedure in Mark's basement involving his brain. That's a little too far for Mark, so he just rips off all the medical equipment and tells Saul, yeah, I'm not doing it, and leaves. One of the side effects of all of this is the fact that you're going to be hungry, so Mark goes and has dinner by himself. But then he's approached by Helena Egan. She makes it seem like the two just happen to run into each other, but you get the sense that this was no accident. Helena introduces herself and then apologizes for the overtime contingency plan. They start making small talk, flirting a little bit. The conversation seems to be going well until Helena messes up Gemma's name. After that, it gets a little bit awkward. Mark has one of his coughing fits, and he just says, you know what, I think it's time that I go. But as he stands up and he goes to leave, he just starts staring at Helena, and something spooks him. He races home, and he tells Saul, all right, hook me up again. I'm sorry for what I did before, but yeah, all right, we need to push. The process is literally going to involve opening up Mark's skull, finding the chip, and surrounding it with a liquid to enhance the process. Saul is able to do it, but it's obviously risky. After stitching him up, Saul tells him, stay still, do not move. But Mark doesn't listen, because there's a knock at his door, and it's Devin. He feels like he has to answer it because his car's in the driveway, she knows he's home, so he staggers upstairs to answer the door. And as she's just making conversation, his head starts pounding. He starts getting flashbacks of being with Helena, but also being with his wife. The pain is excruciating, until finally, he just collapses on the ground. He's convulsing, he's having seizures. Devin doesn't know what to do, and Saul rushes upstairs, to Devin's surprise, and says, don't touch him. As for Irving, he went over to Bert's place. He ended up meeting Bert's husband, Fields, and they had a nice dinner. They talked about Bert's involvement with Lumen, and why Bert got involved with Lumen in the first place. That had to do with heaven. He didn't think that he would be able to get in on his own, but the innie might. The conversation, though, does get a bit awkward when they start talking about Fields and Bert's relationship. Bert recalls something that happened 10 years ago, but Fields says no, it was 20. We were with your Lumen partner. And why that's weird is because, as Irving points out, the first severed office opened 12 years ago. He asks for clarification, and Bert says, no, you're right. And then Bert turns to Fields and says, maybe that's enough of that? Don't mention it. So Bert's clearly hiding something. And then the conversation gets really awkward when Fields brings up the fact that Bert was fired for having a sexual relationship with another coworker, and that coworker is literally sitting at the table right now. The conversation is pretty upsetting for Fields, so when the night wraps up and Irving goes to leave, he asks Bert, is Fields okay? And Bert tells him, yeah, he just gets fuzzy, like saying that I worked at Lumen 20 years ago when it was 10. Irving, though, tells him he had a good time, and he says, we should do it again sometime. To which Bert asks, with Fields or without? And Irving says, either way, and then he heads home. But what he didn't know was that somebody was at his apartment during the entire dinner party. It was Mr. Drummond. He let himself in using his own key, and then he went to the trunk full of a bunch of information regarding Lumen employees, and he started scouring over it. Now, while all that was going on inside Lumen, Innie Dillon tells both Helly and Mark about what he found behind the poster. They ask him, why didn't you just take it? Why'd you leave it there? And Dillon says, I don't want to get in trouble right now. And that's probably because he has another date with his Audi's wife. Helly says, you know what, fine, I'll go get it, and Dillon takes off. But as Mark is looking through the fridge, he starts having a memory with his Audi, and he doesn't know what's going on. He snaps out of it pretty quick, but he wants to have a private conversation with Helly, so they head to the bathroom. They get in a stall, and Mark starts telling her about how Milchick kind of threatened him. Helly thinks it's because they want to split the two. Divide, knowing full well what would happen if the two worked together. And Helly says, I'm going to go get that map. But before she leaves, Mark tells her, hey, we slept together. At least, I thought it was you. In reality, it was your Audi. This news is really upsetting to Helly. She's trying to process it in her own way, all the while Mark is apologizing, saying, I thought it was you. She just kind of feels used. While Helly was just trying to wrap her brain around the fact that her and Mark kind of slept together, Dylan did go to that meeting with his Audi's wife. Gretchen continues to tell Dylan all about what his Audi is like on the outside, and any Dylan really takes to Gretchen. He wants to be with her all the time. It gets to the point where when the meeting is over, they end up kissing. I mean, like, actually kissing. And when Gretchen gets home that night and Audi Dylan asks her, hey, how was the meeting? She lies and says, it got canceled. Back over with Helly, though, after finally processing what happened, she decides, you know what? I want my own memory. And she tracks down Mark and she explains, she used me in the process. She has that memory and I don't, so I want it. And Mark is all about that. I mean, sex again? That sounds cool. So the two go off and find an empty office, and they make a sort of makeshift tent. And then they do the thing. They do the sex thing. As they're walking back to their actual office, they're like two giddy school children. They start kissing in the hallway, but then Helly notices that Mark is bleeding out of the nose. This kind of came out of nowhere, so they have to go to the nurse, which just happens to be Miss Wong. She starts doing the typical questions. How did it happen? They don't know. And then she asks him, what symptoms have you had? Have you had, like, hallucinations? And even though any Mark has had hallucinations, he tells her, no, I haven't. And being there in the room with Miss Wong, that was the memory that Audi Mark had had. Miss Wong, by the way, had one hell of a day. It started with a meeting with Milchick. He has a pretty good idea of who complained about his vocabulary. He thinks it was Miss Wong. She was also really interested in how his performance review was going to go. And she even goes so far as to ask once again, but he doesn't tell her. Instead, he reminds her that she can't graduate from the fellowship until he's deemed her wintertime material. This will mean using her time well, focusing on her duties, and eradicating childish follies. Yeah, he really got the message about the whole vocabulary thing. But then he puts her in charge of the floor because he wants to go work on the things that were in his performance review. The first thing he works on is putting paper clips on paper. It was one of the complaints. And then he does end up working on the vocabulary. But Seth Milchick's entire demeanor has completely changed.
Thank you so much for checking out this recap. Please consider subscribing to the channel and subscribing to my Patreon. Hit thumbs up if you liked it. Smash that thumbs down button if you thought it sucked. If you left a comment, I don't get back to you. I usually don't check the comments unless they're like a super comment. Also, if you don't see the next video up on the end screen, not to worry, it'll be up in a day or two.